a rather peculiar nature of the Confucian style of moral reasoning is that it's never developed something very critical, important in many important styles of moral reasoning in the West, namely the concept of rights. In fact, we'll get a chance to examine the predicament of the modern transformation of Confucian ethics in reference to the challenge of the Western idea of rights. How can a style of moral reasoning, sophisticated as it is, that has never developed a conception of rights and yet able to develop a coherent vision of being human based upon the concept of duty? This is the purpose of our deliberation this morning. You are now still very much involved in the study of the first of the 5 10 diagrams. And I'm going to make some reference to these 10 diagrams in the second part of the talk. But to begin, I would like to underscore what a number of ethicists or scholars who are involved in the study of ethics now come to realize as a major deficiency in modern academic training. We're very good at focusing on the acquisition of knowledge, developing all kinds of strategies for us to learn increasingly complicated information systems, ideas in a comparative nature, highly professionalized. But one particular area that is probably equally important for the survival and flourishing of any society that is totally lacking is a kind of ethical intelligence. I'm not talking about emotional intelligence. I don't even understand the meaning of that term. Ethical intelligence is critical to any style of moral reasoning. The modern economy, East or West, does not provide, in general, any courses, any training for ethical intelligence. Normally, we are left by ourselves, try to develop some conception. It's related to the idea of a worldview, the idea of the meaning structure of society. What is meaningful for me as a human being, issues of that nature. In the Confucian tradition, the language of the heart, but also the language of the mind, but emphasizing on the language of the heart, features very prominently in this particular style of moral reasoning. The terms that now we try to introduce, especially in the second part of the course, the so-called Neo-Confucian terms, such as vital energy, principle or pattern, heart and mind, human nature. These terms on the surface are abstract concepts, abstract ideas. But for the Neo-Confucians, they all intended to be part not just of our mental furniture, but of our vehicles or tools for us to try to conceptualize, to think in terms of ethical intelligence. In other words, all these terms, including terms like the supreme ultimate, or terms of heaven and earth, are all linked to the cultivation of a kind of ethical intelligence that should be able to guide our way of life. You may have many different approaches to it, but these conceptual apparatuses, these tools, could be considered as skills for us to try to think through some of these issues. One major assumption is the celebration of life. if you accept the Confucian mode of thinking, it privileges the importance of vitality, health, but also the mental strength as well as the physical strength, dynamism, and openness to new possibilities, connections. To not just to have life, but to exist in the sense that to be counted as an existential being, we have to be in the process of transformation. So there's an affirmation of life, not just life as imagined, but this particular form of life, this particular culture, this world, and of course, this human condition. In other words, the things that are near at hand. The affirmation of life is the affirmation of this particular form of life, and affirmation, the culture that has constructed us and that has helped us to interact in a meaningful way, and the world here and now, as well as the human condition with all the negative factors, ought to be affirmed as a point of departure. So in a classical sense, the Confucian ethical problematique or ethical problem can be very simply stated in the following idea. That is, I am not what I ought to be, and what I must become must take what I am here and now as its top point of departure. It's on the surface, a very simple statement. And you may ask yourself whether it's relevant to you or not. I am not what I ought to be, meaning what I am existentially here and now falls short of what I think I can become, I ought to become. There is a gap between what I am and what I ought to be, or a gap between what my existential situation is and what ideally I can become. This is comparable in all styles of moral reasoning. Any kind of ethical intelligence we need to develop begins with this awareness. I am not what I ought to be. But the Confucian position further specifies, which is somewhat unique. What I ought to be or what I must become is in fact rooted in the structure of what I am here and now. Therefore, I have to take what I am here and now as a point of departure. This is what I considered the courage to be. We have to have the courage to affirm life, to recognize even though I am not what I ought to be, what I am, the existential situation here and now, is endowed with rich resources, spiritual, ethical, intellectual resources for me to transform myself. So the notion that if I can allow myself, allow my true self to mobilize the inner resources for personal growth as an end in itself, then I live up to the Confucian idea of learning for the sake of the self, rather than the learning for the sake of anyone else. Now, how do I recognize my true self? The acquisition of self-knowledge becomes an integral part of my intention of accumulating enough ethical intelligence. Each awareness, each attempt I make to try to understand myself, each awareness will definitely, this may sound a little bit abstract, but it should become clear, will definitely make a difference in my way of life. If not, it is not true knowledge, or if it's not knowledge of the true self. If I truly believe what I must do, I will do it. If I think I should do it and I then fail to do it, it means not true knowledge. It is not the true knowledge of my true self. Often we fail to do what we intend to do. It's part of life. Which means, in the Confucian sense, the habits of the heart are so ingrained that I am in fact passively simply responding to the habits of the heart. In other words, I'm just passively responding to my habitual self, not my true self. The various kinds of habits that have accumulated for so long, and they now shape me into a particular mode of life, even though that mode of life I'm critically aware falls short of what I ought to be, I'm somewhat immobilized. I'm not able to do that because I'm passively responding to the habitual self. The habitual self, from the Confucian point of view, is extremely powerful. It's not evil. It's not something for us to worry about. It is, in fact, the self that is determining my way of life here and now. That's the reason why it is so important to accumulate good habits rather than bad habits. The more good habits we'll be able to accumulate, the more we'll be dictated by the habitual self, which actually will help us to do good things. We follow certain pattern, certain routine, and the routine will help us to flourish, to do our work conscientiously, correctly, turning papers always in time, and we'll be able to correct the mistakes and open to criticism. And even though I know that I will not be able to do all the things that I want to do, the good habits that formed since primary school, high school, have served me very well. But there are also bad habits. And I know I have to overcome these bad habits, but often I do not have a very strong will, the weakness of the will, to overcome them, and I'm not really that worried about it. Because after all, I have accumulated so much good habits. The good habits will be able to overcome the bad ones. But for my own benefit, it's not only important to accumulate good habits. Aristotle and all kinds of Xunzi and others all instructed us how important that is, habit formation. But always capable of referring to another agent, which in ordinary intellectual discourse, we do not appeal to that at all, because it sounds mysterious. But in fact, it's not at all. Another agent we call conscience. Conscience is not simply an expression of our habits. It's something so deeply rooted in our being that it should be able to function. Conscience, in the classical Freudian sense in the West, we're very much seasoned by that particular thinking, often functions as a negative sanction. Thou shalt not. It's often the form. Bad conscience. I've done something that I ought not have done, then I have bad conscience. Or some people say even shame or guilt. This is because in the Freudian sense, which is very much a part of our mental furniture now, we have internalized superego. The so-called internalized superego is often the instructions we receive from our parents. It's what the society wants us to become. When we're very young, in primary school and so forth, through the instructions of our parents, we gradually internalize some behavioral pattern. And it functions often, thou shalt not. You should not do this, you should not do that. And that superego internalizing us becomes very important in our way of receiving new information, process new information, or forming our own habits. But also there are, from the Freudian sense, there's it, which instinctual demands. not just sex, but all kinds of other, what the Confucians would call desires, private desires. These are natural flow of our desires. But also this idea of the ego in the Freudian sense. I'm not using that word always in the positive sense. I'm sometimes using this in a negative sense. So you overcome your private ego in order to develop your true self. So self and ego. But ego in the Freudian sense is a positive idea. That is your personal identity. Your personal identity, the growth, your personal identity has to overcome the internalized superego, which is the society, your parents, and other people try to ask you what to do. At the same time, you have to try to harmonize or overcome the desires, the instinctual demands. That's how you develop your true personal identity. And of course, at age of 17 or 18, from the classical Freudian idea, you often suffer from identity crisis. And that identity crisis is linked both to the power of the superego. Am I doing this right because my parents wanted me to do this and I now are attracted to some other things? And am I being ungrateful, disobedient, whether I'm really following the superego and doing it, or I become a slave of my it, or I will be able to develop some kind of inner strength of my ego, try to chart or negotiate a narrow path in between. These are the issues, whether you like it or not, whether you use the language to analyze yourself, part of your growing up. And this idea of conscience as negative sanction, thou shalt not, in the Confucian context, it often functions as a positive encouragement. This is what we called the primordial awareness. Primordial awareness, meaning very fundamental, very basic awareness. Primordial meaning very basic, very deep awareness, being aware. This primordial awareness, all the Neo-Confucians assume, is that something every human being, whether you are highly educated or not, every human being is endowed with. That's the agency that often you need to appeal to for the development of your ethical intelligence. We all know, we're all aware of the fact that there's a thick veil of ignorance. Often we have to admit, I really do not truly understand myself. There's a very interesting anecdote in the Zen tradition, the Buddhist tradition, totally devoted to enlightenment. So this monk, after a long time of cultivation, seems to have enlightened, but then one day he sees himself in the mirror, and he looked at this monkish-looking fellow. He says, I know I am enlightened, but who are you? Who are you? You know, looking at your own face. Who's this person with this face? I know I'm enlightened. Every day when you face the mirror, especially you're somewhat depressed, the question often arises, who is this guy? Do I really recognize him or her? And that sense of ignorance, from the Confucian point of view, is common. There are so many layers, so many possibilities of our ways of being human that are not necessary part of our knowledge. So there is always a veil of ignorance. To recognize that what we are ignorant, especially ignorant about ethical intelligence, is the beginning of wisdom. If you look at the 10 diagrams and you become totally confused, and I think this is a sign of the beginning of wisdom. If you think you know everything about the 10 diagrams, it's not just arrogance, it's totally unreal. So when you're confronted with these issues, because these are cumulative experience expressed in intelligent terminology by some of the people who have gone through this process. Maybe they're culturally constrained, the time is different. Maybe when they did this, they responded to all kinds of their super egos imposed upon them that are not part of us and so forth. That's fine. But one very important underlying assumption of the Confucian tradition, actually of all the East Asian traditions, is that the commonality of ethical intelligence is taken for granted. In other words, whether you are in ancient Greece or in the Judaic world or in the modern West, all the people share some commonality in terms of ethical intelligence. The communicability of this kind of wisdom, not information, not knowledge. Information, knowledge always become outdated and often limited because of time, because culture, because particular religious considerations. But ethical intelligence, from this point of view, is communicable. It's very fundamental, it's basic. Now, the Confucians then believe you need to develop a comprehensive vision at a very generalized level, not abstract, but very generalized level, a direction of what one want to become. We can say that the 5 diagrams we're now studying, the diagram of the great supreme, the diagram of the supreme ultimate, the diagram of the Western inscription, the diagram of elementary learning, the diagram of the great learning, and the diagram of Zhu Xi's instructions, basic instructions in his so-called Idea Grotto. These are diagrams to give a sense of general direction, especially the first one, the diagram of the supreme ultimate. The general direction is to say human beings are unique as sentient beings, as sensitive beings. To use the Neo-Confucian terminology, which can be easily translated into our modern language, is that a human being receives the finest, the most refined vital energy in the universe. Therefore, human beings are the most spiritual of all beings. Spiritual in the sense human beings are much more sensitive than other animals, than plants, than inanimate beings, in being connected with an ever-expanding network of relationships. Now, this assumption is totally generalizable. Not only that human beings are the most sentient, human beings are in fact, you use the word maybe with biblical implications, are created. Human beings are created not just by the cosmic forces, but by themselves. They're created by themselves to become filial children of heaven and earth. In other words, human beings, the assumption, are endowed with the mission of realizing the creative impulse or the creative process of heaven and earth. So this notion of human beings as co-creators, as filial children of heaven and earth, is to say we are responsible for the well-being of not only our human society, but for the well-being of the cosmos. Because we are the filial children of the cosmos, and we are responsible, obligated, to try to help the cosmic process to run its due course. Now, the classical formulation is that heaven engenders, human completes. Heaven may create the natural process, but to make it meaningful as an enduring cultural project, that is the purpose of our human activity. So all the terms that we've encountered, the term of the pattern, the principle, the term of the vital energy, the term of human destiny, the idea of the human heart and mind and human nature, All these terms ought to be used. You can actually use by yourself to develop a coherent understanding of the role of being human in a very general sense. So the learning of the body, of the mind, of nature, of destiny, as exemplified in the Western inscription, we call it the learning to be human, is also to learn to help heaven to fully develop itself. If you misread it, it becomes blasphemous. How can human beings be so grandiose? But the idea is that we are obligated. We are duty bound to do it. We ought to be humbled by that awareness that we are the most sentient of all the sentient beings in the world. But the Confucians are not philosophers in the Greek sense. They are not prophets in the Judaic sense. They are not monks that have some kind of a particular spiritual agenda. They're not priests. They are not intermediaries helping us to understand heaven, understand ourselves. They are just like us. These are the people who want us to reflect upon the things near at hand. In other words, this grandiose vision of the human as the most sentient beings in the universe, as the co-creators of the universe, is not to help us to look above to heaven, forget about our earth here and now, forget about our surrounding, our environment. It's in fact to give us a way of looking at things near at hand, here and now. That's the reason why elementary learning continues to be an important presence in the Confucian tradition. Even after we've perfected ourselves, we thought that we managed to perfect ourselves in many areas, we still have to go back to elementary learning. Now, in the classical Confucian idea of the elementary learning is sweeping the floor, sprinkle some water and sweeping the floor, like a kid at age of 8 or 9. They simply help the parents to sweep the floor. So do very simple chore in the house. That's elementary learning. But why we have to do this kind of elementary learning? Eventually, we form society as mature persons. It's very simple. Many of you know in the 60s, there's a major movement in California, but all over the country, to form new communities. All kinds of new communities were organized based upon political ideas, based upon spiritual development, based upon all kinds of fascinating common interests. Virtually all these communities in the 60s failed, with some notable exceptions. All of them failed. You know why they failed? They failed not because lack of leadership. They failed not because the idealism was not persuasive. They all failed because none of them would be able to endure the routinized work, like who's going to buy food, cook meal, who's going to spend the time in the house and maintaining certain kind of order. These are the things that eventually totally overwhelm these grandiose utopian visions. It is the routinized way of doing things near at hand that turned out to be the most powerful in determining whether you'll be able to realize your ideal. It's not the ideal itself alone, but the process by which it is implemented, and the process by which it's implemented would have to be routinized, would have to be things at hand, would have to be the things that you do day in and day out, would have to be the things that you repeat continuously. Now the difference is this: if the routinized things become totally routinized, and you do it just as habit, this is not going to be salvific, not going to be important for the cultivation of your ethical intelligence. But to do the ordinary things with a sense of renewal every time you do it, that's an art. That's also a spiritual discipline. Extremely, I would say, painfully difficult. To do the things that you ought to do routinely, like brushing your teeth, right? Or set the table, or call your parents once a week, or something like that. The kind of things you have to do, and your habits form for you to do it and yet you'll be able to do it with a sense of renewal, with a sense of excitement, with a sense of new discovery. Like reading a text, which is you're familiar, but repeating that text gives you a new sense of new ideas, new sense, and a sense of renewal. That's what is considered to be the link between elementary learning to great learning. The great learning is a form of practical living which requires sustained effort. The second part of the great learning makes it very, very clear that to be able to renew, not only we have to renew ourselves every day through routinized work, an institution has to renew itself. If the institution becomes so satisfied with its great achievements, it's not going to renew, not going to be critical, not going to refine the routine, the institution is going to suffer. A nation, a society, a multinational corporation, all these structures, human structures, will have to go through the same process. This is the sense that every human being is obligated, is duty-bound to make the whole machinery work. And the machinery is not only our body, not only our institution, our family, not only the state, but the universe as a whole. So in this sense, you have a language of duty and obligation without the language of rights, and yet the functional equivalent of rights is very much at work. You're obligated to do this, and your obligation, my obligation, turns out to be your rights. The obligation of the father to do certain things for the children could turn out to be the rights of the children, and vice versa. So the language of obligation itself is a very complicated language, is a reciprocal language. The Chinese term can be easily misunderstood, and I don't know whether I understand it very well. This idea of fen, which is allotment. Allotment. Now, if you look at the great supreme ultimate, the allotment, to say that human beings receive the most refined essence of the vital energy, is to say every human being's allotment, my allotment, your allotment, the allotment is what constitutes eventually who we are. Of course, earlier I used the expression, the structural limitation, ethnicity, gender, territoriality, socialization, linguistic universe, all these things that we cannot choose turn out to be our fate. And allotment is related to the idea of fate. One is fated to be a particular human being. But the attitude, the Confucian attitude, is not simply the realistic understanding that we are fated to be a particular human being, but also, as a particular human being, we ought to be grateful, ought to be thankful to heaven, to parents, and to society. Now, we need to work this out. On the surface, it seems a very passive notion. Anything that I have, I need to be grateful, even if I'm underprivileged and marginalized. Now, there's one statement, I actually, while I prepare my lectures, I was thinking whether I want to use it or not, because it can be so misleading, but okay. And it's totally politically incorrect. This Confucian thinker of the 17th century made the following remark about his allotment, his fen. He said, I'm very pleased to discover that I'm a human being rather than any other members of the animal kingdom. I'm not a dog, I'm not a pig, I'm not a cat. Now, from the Buddhist notion of transmigration, you have no guarantee what you will become the next time, right? Maybe an ant or an insect. So I'm very happy that I'm a human being. Second remark begins with political incorrectness. I'm very happy I'm Chinese. I'm not a barbarian. No, not like the Jurchens, the Mongols, and so forth. Then it gets worse. I'm very happy that I'm a man. And finally, I'm very happy I was born in a literatus family, not like those poor peasants, merchants, or laborers. So this man, this thinker, celebrated himself, celebrated his allotment, 分, as a human being, as a Chinese, as a man, as a literatus. Now, by implication, this is anthropocentrism. So all the other animals, you cannot expect a dog become very happy as being a dog, because this is totally anthropocentric. This is also culturally specific. Chinese, in this case, become civilized. The barbarians are not. And it's gender, and also elitist in the literatus. But how do we read this particular statement of allotment? What we need to read it is, in fact, the total indeterminacy of the allotment. This is very important to note. Indeterminacy of the allotment. The allotment is how a person is fated to be a person. But once the person is fated to be a person, the person has infinite possibility of self-realization in terms of the allotment. So it's totally, I will argue, it's totally indeterminate. Because it's indeterminate, it can, in fact, ought to be able first to overcome this anthropocentric predicament. That is, the reason that I became a human being in this sense is not, aha, so great that now I'm a human being. But the reason is that becoming a human being as the most sentient being requires much more obligation for my self-realization. Even use the expression of the worst possible situation. All the negative factors. I came to a very poor family, abusive family, and not at all possible for human flourishing, and may even be handicapped physically. And I used the example of Helen Keller before. The worst possible situation, just totally in conflict with what that gentleman talked about. What is the message? What is the Confucian message if I turn out to be like that? The Confucian message is still there's the infinite possibility for self-transformation. Every human being has the infinite possibility for transformation, and that infinite possibility is not constrained in terms of different kind of allotment. In fact, to be a human being, one is more obligated than to be other animals. To be educated or civilized, one is more obligated. To have the more ability in the society to develop than others, one is more obligated. And to be blessed with all kinds of external positive conditions for human flourishing, we become more obligated. So in this sense, the two principles, basic principles of loyalty, meaning true to myself, understand where I stand, and considerateness towards others, still function, still work for every human being. I ought to try to make myself better than I am. And yet, because my understanding of another person is not and can never be as closely, as comprehensively as I ought to know myself, so I always exercise considerateness towards others. I'm very serious about my own intellectual development, and also very serious about being considerate towards others. I don't prejudge others because I do not know to the extent and in the same degree of someone else as I ought to know myself. So that principle of loyalty or sincerity towards oneself and considerateness and reciprocity towards others apply in this particular connection. Therefore, the people who become, it's not the French idea of noblesse oblige, not the French idea that you become a noble person, you have all these privileges, you have all these obligations and responsibilities. That's not the idea at all. The idea is that every human being is obligated, is duty-bound to perform specific function totally appropriate to the allotment. Every human being, because of the particular allotment. And yet, since it's indeterminate, the more we become prominent, the more we become educated, the more we get a chance to go to great institutions for higher learning, the more we are obligated to the society, to ourselves, to all the other people. Now, for a number of years, with the rights consciousness, we'll get a chance to talk about that. This is the question of entitlement. I'm entitled to have this or that. The idea of entitlement is diametrically opposed to the idea of responsibility. The idea of responsibility is all the entitlements that I have are subject to further negotiation, not because I'm naturally born to have all this. It is because I'm blessed with all these conditions, not because of my conscience, not because of my allotment. There are all kinds of other conditions enter into the picture. So the more resources we command, we consume, the more we are obligated to replenish it as our duty, as our responsibility. This links to a critical East Asian term. In Japanese, it's called on, or in Korean, turn of gratitude. This on is the sense that what we do not deserve what we receive. What we receive is so much beyond what we deserve that we should have a strong sense of gratefulness. The whole ritual world, the world organized by ritual, by constraint, is very much based upon this, I call it the system of interchange. What we're going to give and what we've received. And we're part of this system of interchange. And the system of interchange is not just individuals, but sometimes even societies or even human species. Give you a very radical example to see how this functions, not just in Confucian society, but virtually in all indigenous religious societies. This is example, I call it a radical example of ritual constraint or ritual restraint in this interchange, in reference to the idea of obligation. This is from Hawaii. In the classical Hawaiian tradition, and there's such sense of the interplay between the human community on the one hand and the larger natural world on the other, that one ought to exercise the sense of obligation every time one does anything radical. Whenever the Hawaiians, maybe a tribe, decided they have to cut down a major tree, 400 years old and so forth, for lumber, and major decision will have to be made, a human sacrifice will have to be made. A member of the Hawaiian tribe community would be sacrificed, sometimes a child. It's a human sacrifice to the earth because we have to take this 400-year-old tree for our lumber. It's an interchange. Now, the logic, the ethical intelligence that they develop is that if we want to take something from the earth, we, members of the human community, are obligated to be able to repay. Now, in terms of survival tactic or survival strategy, this has so much constrained the Hawaiian community in terms of its exploitation of nature. They will be able to survive for generations in that environment, because any kind of exploitation of that environment will have a major consequence in the well-being of the society as a whole. So in this sense, that on the gratitude, it becomes a moral awareness of the person. We become morally aware that we are obligated. In the classical Chinese tradition, the on is often in reference to one's parents. Our body is the gift. And there's no way, no matter how hard we try, we'll ever be able to repay. So the kind of poetic expression is the heart of a blade of grass will never be able to repay the benevolence of the warmth of the sun in the spring. Now, the warmth of the sun in the spring is the magnificent loving care of the parents. And the heart of the blade of grass, of course, is a child who's not, is incapable of eventually to repay it. But in the order of things in the world, that we can always develop an internal resonance with the world in order to facilitate this interchange. I'll give you another anecdote. I have only a couple of minutes to do that. From the aesthetic point of view, let's say a painter who wants to capture the spirit of the mountain. Instead of simply trying to paint the mountain from the distance, the idea is the person will have to go into the mountain and live in the mountain, hopefully for a few months and for a few years, to be able to establish a spiritual communion with the mountain. And after he's done that, he can come back and will be able to recreate the spirit of the mountain in his studio. So you have to involve yourself in the whole process of understanding nature rather than simply look at it as an I-it relationship. You immerse yourself into it and you appreciate the spirit of the mountain walking around, like you go to the Yosemite, and then you come back and be able to recreate the spirit of the mountain. Now, there are many important implications. I have time only to mention just one. One implication is that if the world is based upon this sense of obligation, duty, then the world is such that the first ethical intelligence that we ought to develop is to celebrate life and to have a reverence for life, because we are the recipient of that particular vital energy. I visited Korea a few years ago and attended a meeting, and everybody was giving this. Everyone connected with Tui Ge, who's the author of the 10 sagely diagrams. And I don't know if any of you recognize this character, which means reverence. You know, we talked about the word respectfulness, reverence. And this term, reverence, features most prominently in his 5 other diagrams that we'll be able to discuss next week.